Well, for more on this and his analysis, I want to bring in now Andrew Rasiulis. He is a fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and a retired Department of National Defense official. We've reached him in Ottawa. Thank you, Andrew, for taking the time. I want to start off by getting your take here. What do you make of the Wagner Group's apparent mutiny?
Well, this is a revolt against the way that the war has been conducted, not necessarily about the war itself. Prigozhin keeps saying he's a patriot. And he has not given up, I believe, on the war against Ukraine to establish a Russian sphere of influence. I don't think he's not opposed to that. But he is opposed, what he says, the corrupt way in which the Russian Ministry of Defense has conducted the war. Specifically, his complaints are also about how the Wagner Group has been repeatedly shortchanged by the Ministry of Defense supply chain to him and shortchanged his troops. So they have suffered because of Russian corruption. That's his gripe. And he's also revolting directly against Minister Shoigu, the Minister of Defense of Russia.
So some key officials there. But Andrew, I wonder, a lot of Canadians may be watching this and thinking, could this be a precursor to a coup d'etat? What do you think?
Right now, this is a very specific revolt against the Ministry of Defense. It could spread and become wider. But the Russian military has not yet, we haven't seen their reaction yet. As your report just indicated, the Russians, the Wagner Group seems to have come into Rostov-on-Don relatively unopposed. Well, that's significant, but that doesn't tell the full story. On the other hand, we also know that Russian forces are still engaging in certain combat operations as this is happening. So we have to wait to see what the Russian Ministry of Defense does, and actually the political power base around Putin. In 1917, Putin made this reference in his speech this morning about 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, and there was actually the 1916 revolution by Kerensky. These revolts, particularly the Kerensky revolt, was against the Tsar in the way the war was being conducted, not against the war itself. That is a similar pattern. It's a complaint on the corruption, not the war itself. And this could have a spin out. It could be controlled. We just do not know where it's going to go.
As we wait and watch for that, I'm wondering perhaps if you can shed light on why Wagner might be rebelling now. As you said, they've had issues with the leaders, the military leaders, for quite some time. So why is this happening now, do you think?
Well, it must have reached a certain point for Prigozhin, because as the Ukrainian offensive started in the last couple of weeks, the Russians have done relatively well against the Ukrainian attacks, but the Wagner Group was being pulled out of Bakhmut for refurbishment and to be committed to another fight somewhere else. That was the narrative up until a few days ago. So the question is, something happened in between. And now Prigozhin says his troops were bombed by the Russian Air Force, and that this is what really twisted him and turned him into an open revolt. Now, this has not been verified, these attacks, but that's what Prigozhin is claiming was the trigger that changed the situation.
And Andrew, what do we know about the head of Wagner, Prigozhin himself?
Prigozhin is a very interesting character. He comes from St. Petersburg, so he shares that birthplace with Putin. He had a rough life. In the Soviet Union, he was a criminal. He had been imprisoned in the Soviet criminal system for, regular criminal crimes, whatever it was. He made himself after the fall of the Soviet Union, became an entrepreneur, and is known as Putin's chef, in the sense that he started a catering service. And that catering service, through various connections in St. Petersburg, became Putin's catering service, the Kremlin's catering service. And he catered, President Bush on his visit and that sort of thing. So, and then he got into the mercenary business. He's not a soldier himself, but he's a financier, a business person. But he decided to get into this mercenary business to help Russian foreign policy and defense interests in Africa, predominantly, as it sort of started, and then to Syria, and then eventually he went to Ukraine. So he saw himself as an outlier, not part of the regular military, but a supporter of Putin, who was going to do things a little perhaps more effectively than the regular Russian army could, but advance Russian interests, especially advance Putin's interests.
What could this open rebellion have in terms of implications for the war in Ukraine?
That is the big question. So in 1916-17, of course, those revolts against the Tsar and the way the war was going were devastating. The Germans and the Austrians advanced significantly against the Russian lines in World War I and led eventually to the surrender of Russia. But in this case, it's, again, premature. History doesn't always repeat itself. It echoes. So the question is, will the Russian army hold? Where will the Russian army go? Will they support Wagner? Or will they put him down? That is the big question here. Putin says they're going to put him down. They're putting together all the counter revolt measures, if you will, around Moscow and all the other areas, closing the highways leading to Moscow. So the game is on, and we don't know which way it's going to go.
All right, we will watch for that. Thank you so much for your time this morning. Andrew Rasiulis is a fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and a retired Department of National Defense official. We reached him this morning in Ottawa.